I tried to understand why he behaved the way he did and why he was so reckless and callous and honestly abusive to other women.
This is Matt Lauer, the trusted news anchor who once defined American mornings.
For decades, television news operated on an unspoken hierarchy. Anchors were untouchable. Producers, assistants, and junior staff learned early who held the power to make or break career, and who didn't. Then, in the span of about a year, that hierarchy cracked in public, over and over again, until it was clear this wasn't a scandal about one man or one network. It was a reckoning that reached into nearly every major American news organization. This is the story of how that reckoning unfolded, not through the private lives of the people at its center, but through the institutions that enabled, ignored, and eventually could no longer protect them. The chain of events traces back to October 2017, when the New York Times and the New Yorker published investigations into film producer Harvey Weinstein, detailing decades of alleged sexual harassment and assault involving dozens of women in the entertainment industry. The reporting, by journalists including Jodi Kantor, Megan Twohey, and Ronan Farrow, didn't just end Weinstein's career. It changed what counted as a story. Within days, the phrase Me Too, coined years earlier by activist Tarana Burke to support survivors of sexual violence, became a viral hashtag, as millions of people shared their own experiences of harassment and assault. What started as a conversation about Hollywood quickly moved into newsrooms themselves, because journalism, it turned out, had the same power imbalances it had spent weeks reporting on in other industries. Television news was hit early and hard. In November 2017, NBC News fired veteran correspondent and Fox News' Alan Mark Halperin after multiple women accused him of sexual harassment during his years at ABC News. That same month, PBS and CBS both severed ties with Charlie Rose, the longtime host of PBS's Charlie Rose and the CBS This Morning anchor, after the Washington Post published accounts from several women who worked with or for him describing unwanted sexual advances, including some allegations dating back decades. Then, on November 29, 2017, NBC announced it had fired Matt Lauer, the network's longtime Today Show anchor, after a colleague came forward with a complaint about his conduct during the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. NBC chairman Andy Lack told staff it was the first formal complaint the network had received about Lauer in his more than 20 years there, though the network said it had reason to believe it might not be an isolated incident. Additional accounts followed within days, reported by outlets including the New York Times and Variety, describing alleged misconduct spanning multiple years. Lauer, in a public statement at the time, said some of what was being reported was untrue or mischaracterized, but acknowledged there was enough truth in the accounts to make him feel embarrassed and ashamed. He has not been criminally charged. In 2019, journalist Ronan Farrow's book Catch and Kill included an account from former NBC producer Brooke Nevils, who alleged Lauer had assaulted her during the Sochi Olympics. Lauer disputed her characterization of the encounter, saying in an open letter that the relationship had been consensual. Nevils has said she received a settlement from NBC in connection with her complaint. The dispute between their two accounts remains part of the public record, and it illustrates something important about this whole period. The reckoning didn't produce uniform, uncontested narratives. It produced conflicting claims, litigated in public, that news organizations and readers had to weigh for themselves. What made this moment different from earlier harassment scandals wasn't just the number of allegations. It was the pattern connecting them. Investigative reporting, particularly Farrow's work, both at the New Yorker and later in book form, repeatedly found evidence that institutions had known, or had reason to know, about misconduct long before it became public. Former NBC correspondent Linda Vester said publicly that network management had been aware of concerns about Lauer's behavior well before his firing, a claim NBC disputed. Farrow's reporting also described how Weinstein, during his effort to suppress the Times and New Yorker stories about himself, had reportedly used knowledge of unrelated allegations against NBC figures as leverage against the network. Whether or not every detail of that account is contested, the broader picture of institutions weighing reputational risk against employee safety, often for years before acting, became a through line across nearly every case this period surfaced. By early 2018, the list of media figures who had lost jobs following harassment allegations included Fox News host Bill O'Reilly, who departed the network in 2017 after reporting revealed a series of settlements with women who had accused him of harassment. NPR's top news executive Michael Oresks, who resigned after multiple women described unwanted advances, and CBS News chairman and 60 Minutes executive producer Jeff Fager, who left the network in 2018 following harassment allegations and criticism of how he handled a related investigation. In September 2018, CBS chief executive Leslie Moonves resigned after the New Yorker published accounts from multiple women accusing him of sexual misconduct spanning decades. CBS later determined it would not pay Moonves the severance package tied to his exit, citing findings from an internal investigation. Each case had its own specific facts, and treating them as identical would flatten real differences in what was alleged and what was ultimately established. But taken together, they made an argument that no single scandal could. This wasn't a handful of bad actors. It was a structural feature of an industry where a small number of people controlled hiring, advancement, and reputation, largely without outside accountability. There's a reason the media industry became such a visible epicenter of this reckoning, beyond the fact that journalists were the ones telling the story. Television news, especially, runs on parasocial trust. Audiences invite anchors into their homes every morning and evening, and networks spend enormous resources cultivating that sense of familiarity and credibility. That dynamic gives on-air talent unusual leverage internally. A morning show anchor who anchors a franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising revenue is, in a very direct sense, harder to discipline than an anchor without that leverage. Several of the reporters who broke these stories noted this dynamic explicitly. The people best positioned to complain about a powerful colleague were often the people with the least power to do anything about it. Assistants, junior producers, young reporters early in their careers, aware that the person they might report was also the person who could end their careers with a phone call. Non-disclosure agreements, common in exit settlements across the industry, meant that even when institutions did act, the terms of departure often came with silence attached, which delayed the public's understanding of how widespread the pattern actually was. Media companies didn't respond uniformly, and the differences are instructive. Some conducted outside investigations and published findings, at least in summary form. NBC commissioned an internal review after criticism that it had been too slow to investigate Lauer and had a culture that discouraged complaints. The network's own counsel led that review, which drew criticism from some outside observers who argued an external, independent investigator would have carried more credibility. CBS, following the Moonves matter, commissioned a report from outside law firms that was more critical, finding that women who complained about harassment at CBS News and 60 Minutes had faced retaliation, and that top executives had worked to suppress complaints. Many organizations updated harassment policies, added anonymous reporting channels, and in some cases changed how NDAs could be used in settlement agreements. Whether those changes represent durable culture change or a temporary response to bad press is a question that outlasted the initial wave of coverage, and it's one media critics and labor researchers continued to debate in the years that followed. It's worth pausing on something that often gets lost in accounts of this period. The people who came forward were not, for the most part, seeking the kind of public attention they received. Brooke Nevils has spoken publicly about how difficult the process of coming forward was, both in television interviews and in Farrow's book, describing significant personal and psychological cost. Other women who accused figures across the industry chose to remain anonymous, speaking to reporters on condition that their names not be used, which is itself telling about the risk calculus involved in speaking up even after the initial dam had broken. At the same time, the men at the center of these stories experienced consequences that varied widely. Some, like Weinstein, faced criminal prosecution and were convicted. Others, including Lauer, have not faced criminal charges, and the allegations against them remain civil and reputational matters, rather than matters resolved by a court. That distinction matters, and responsible retrospectives on this period generally noted explicitly rather than blurring the line between lost his job following allegations and was found guilty of a crime. 5 years on, assessments of #MeToo's impact on the media industry are mixed. On one hand, the era clearly shifted norms around what would be tolerated publicly and what newsroom leadership could survive politically. Boards and executives who might once have quietly managed a complaint now had to reckon with the possibility that silence itself would become the story. Journalists who broke these stories, including Farrow, Cantor, and Toohey, received major recognition, including Pulitzer Prizes, cementing accountability journalism about workplace misconduct as a durable beat rather than a one-off news cycle. On the other hand, critics, including some of the women who came forward during this period, have pointed out that structural power imbalances in media companies remain largely intact. A handful of executives and on-air figures still hold outsized influence over careers. Settlement agreements, though somewhat more constrained by new state laws in places like California and New York limiting the use of NDAs in harassment cases, still shape how much the public ultimately learns. And several of the men who lost prominent positions during this period have, in the years since, found paths back into some form of public or semi-public life, which raises ongoing questions about what accountability is supposed to look like once the initial consequence, losing a job, has already occurred. Perhaps the most honest way to describe this period of media history is that it didn't resolve so much as it recalibrated. It exposed how much institutional knowledge existed about misconduct well before any public reckoning arrived. It showed that even celebrated, trusted institutions, the ones whose entire business model depends on public trust, were not immune to protecting their own interests over the people working inside them. And it left behind a body of reporting, largely built on the accounts of people who had far more to lose than to gain by speaking, that fundamentally changed what audiences expect newsrooms to do when the story is about themselves. The individual names attached to this period, Weinstein, Lauer, Rose, Halperin, Moonves, and others, will likely remain the shorthand people reach for when this era comes up. But the more durable story isn't about any single one of them. It's about an industry forced, briefly and imperfectly, to apply its own standards of scrutiny to itself, and about what happened and didn't happen once it did.